What's new from Apple? There's the new iPhone 16 Pro, built for Apple Intelligence. And it comes with the all-new camera control, giving you an easier way to quickly access your camera tools. The new Apple Watch Series 10 has our biggest display and our thinnest design ever. And this? It's the sound of active noise cancellation, now available on one of 2 new AirPods 4 models. So quiet. Check out all of the new products and new features at apple.com. You can even buy yourself something new. See apple.com for product availability updates. Apple Intelligence coming this fall.
Your teen requested a ride, but this time not from you. It's through their Uber teen account. You drive your teenager around, a lot, to their friend Jacob's house, their other friend Jake's house, to James's, to Jaden's, to Jalen's, to...
Mom? This is Jake's house, not Jacob's.
Now with an Uber teen account, your teen can request a ride under your supervision. They'll ride with a highly rated driver, and with live trip tracking, you'll follow along the whole ride to their friends' houses that all sound the same. Add your teen to your Uber account today. See app for details.
Bye, Mom.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, X, Threads, and Facebook at Red Treehouse Pod. And now you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits, including personal shoutouts, early access to episodes, bonus episodes, and more. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. As always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note, sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. When people find out I love spooky, scary, and creepy things, one of the first questions they ask is, do you believe this stuff is real? The first question is usually followed by a second question, and then a statement. Have you ever seen a ghost or experienced anything scary? I have. These are some of my favorite conversations to have, not only because of the stories, but also because I learn pretty quickly if the person is a believer in the paranormal and supernatural, or if they're a skeptic. Recently, I posted on social media asking for scary listener stories and experiences. I wanted to hear from Red Treehouse listeners. I'm truly convinced, whether someone is a believer or a skeptic, that we've all experienced something strange that we simply can't dismiss offhand. And I've said it so many times before, there is the possibility, however slim, that what we can't explain as natural and normal just might be supernatural and paranormal. In today's episode of The Red Treehouse, we're going to hear 5 strange and scary stories from 4 Red Treehouse listeners. A huge thank you to each of them for taking the time to submit these stories. They're shared in no particular order, but I assure you, they're all scary stories to keep you up at night. Along the way, ask yourself these questions. What scary experiences have you had? What has given you the creepy feeling that you aren't alone? And is it possible that there was more than the rational mind can explain away? I'll share the stories. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. Our first story comes to us from Kimberly Mansfield. She's an author and paranormal investigator. You can follow her on Threads at @lavendercalligraphy_. And you can find her book, Trials of the Serpent, on Amazon and Kindle Unlimited. Quote, "The sun was setting. The impending event of the night had me fraught with nervousness. The city was still covered in snow, streetlights illuminating the patches winter left behind. The building was in sight, and as we made the trek up the hill, equipment safely stashed in an old backpack, I took a breath, trying to find courage. It was my first time investigating a haunted building, and after fearing the paranormal for so long, I was determined to face my fears, no matter what was in store for me. The Washoe Club was one of the buildings that survived the fire of 1875, a blaze that consumed most of the town. An old building, uninsulated, keeping a chill fit for what waited inside. I couldn't help but wonder if its dark past lent a hand in that, but shook the thought off as it felt foolish to think so. And so, we entered, a feeling of unease nestled within. The guide awaited us, mentioning to the bartender that he was waiting for his overnight to arrive. We had, and we took an extensive tour, listening to the stories he told with enthusiasm and soul. A doll made with human hair, an old piano, and a card table were some of the trigger objects that rested inside. Old furniture from the past. But most of all, the stories were what impacted us most. We were comprised of 8, skeptics and believers alike. I wasn't sure where I stood, despite my fear. But my perspective was changed when we began to use the equipment we brought. We turned the spirit box on, asking the typical questions of an investigator. If anyone was with us. If they could tell us their names. I thought I heard Alan in between sweeps, and suggested we use the voice recorder to confirm. I couldn't conceive of what happened next. When asked again if someone was with us, this time using the name Alan, we received a very chilling, very drawn-out yes in response. I tried my hardest not to be stricken with fear, and instead thanked Alan for his participation. I was a skeptic in a way, not believing most claims of evidence received. After this night, I questioned it even more, but in the way of wanting to continue the hunt, with hopes to gain more evidence of the other side." End quote. Our second story comes from Trent. You can follow him on Threads at Trent Has Thoughts. Quote, "I've got one from my childhood that still makes me uncomfortable more than 30 years later. One day, in 1990 or so, my mom and I went thrift store shopping. The place was as you would expect it. Unorganized, poorly laid out, lots of broken junk. But on the top shelf of a bookcase, stuffed with games like Operation, was something called Ouija. I grabbed it out of curiosity and was struck by the somewhat unsettling black and blue cover with a mysterious figure and only the name of the game on the cover. My mom got it for me, and it too was as you expected. The board was slightly peeling, and the planchette had a broken leg. I read the rules and found one that stuck out to me. Don't ask the Ouija board nonsensical questions. I did nothing with it until a few days later, when one afternoon, before my parents were home, 2 of my friends came overboard. We opened the box of board up, and I put my hands on the planchette. We were laughing and not taking it serious at all. No spirit was going to talk to us through a broken board game. So I asked it, "Are you evil? When will I die?" The game piece didn't move. We laughed. And then, the phone rang. Right at that moment. It rang once. And when I picked it up, the line was staticky and silent. No call from my parents. No caller ID. No reason for anyone to call and let it ring once. No one knowing what we were doing with that board at that moment. We laughed, but it scared us. A few days later, the same friends came over, and we laughed about it and decided to do it again. "Why do you want to talk to us? Are you evil?" At that moment, the phone rang again, just once, with nothing on the other line but static. It terrified me, and I did everything I could to get rid of the board without getting into trouble. Finally, just to get it out of sight, out of mind, I put it in the garage where I knew it'd be forgotten and eventually thrown out. After my parents passed away and people had taken what they wanted from the house, I looked for the black and blue box but didn't see it. It had been 2 decades, and I was still scared of it. Years and years went by, and I was having a drink with a friend. The Nightmare had just come out, and he swore he was a finalist to make it in the documentary. Sure, dude. I asked him what scared him so badly that he was experiencing actual trauma from it, and then he told me. I had this Ouija board we found at some garage sale. One of the legs on the thing was broken. I felt like it was evil. A mass-produced board game or not, I won't fuck with a Ouija board to this day. It still scares me. And I'll never forget those phone calls. End quote. Our third and fourth stories come from MAYAROSE. She's an author. You can follow her on Threads at m.rakennnasferu. And you can find her book, To Walk on Water, on Kindle Unlimited. Quote, I've had paranormal experiences my entire life. Some have been exceedingly creepy, and some have just been downright bizarre. From ghosts and prophetic dreams, to missing time and mimics. Before the Great Disease, a favorite pastime was garage sailing. I love antiques and vintage jewelry, and as much as I absolutely hate living in Florida, early summer used to be the best time to find them. My area has a lot of community sales around May, so we were driving around to them when we saw a moving sale. To preface here, I am somewhat of a psychic. It's not something I can turn on and off, and it's probably contributed to my lifetime of weirdness. So I am quite used to feeling different energies in different places. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but I can generally ignore it. My wife is not. She doesn't see or feel anything out of the ordinary. So her paranormal experiences are like people who do not have whatever you want to call this ability. The moment we set foot in this house, the energy was so high, I was actually getting kind of lightheaded. Everything in the house was for sale, and there were a lot of people. I felt a woman's presence who was very distressed. I'm not sure if she was just hanging on, or didn't realize she was not alive anymore. But she was not happy about all the people in her space. I tried very hard to ignore this energy, and I already decided not to buy anything. She did not want anyone there, and I didn't want to further cause her distress. So, we went back outside. But one of the other people I was with was asking about a dresser. The man who owned the house was elderly and told us he was moving in with his daughter because his wife had recently died. Here's the strange part. My wife also felt the energy. It was also making her lightheaded. She couldn't sense the woman, just the senses of sadness and anger." End quote. Here's our fourth story, also from MAYAROSE. Quote, "This one may or may not be paranormal. I was raised in an Orthodox Roman Catholic family, so I am pretty familiar with the Bible. I am just as into anime and costuming as I am the paranormal, and we went to a lot of conventions before the great closing down. I am notorious for ghost stories and random paranormal tangents at these cons, especially if there's someone who's willing to listen. This convention, I was dressed as Lucifer, possessed Sam from Supernatural, and I had gone on something of a tangent explaining something about the show. It was close to 1 a.m., and the room was dark. My other friends had just laid down to try to sleep. I don't remember exactly what I was trying to explain, but I had to go on a side story to explain why I thought something was so funny to me. So I told her that Lucifer meant light bearer. I was facing the hotel room door, and right after I said that, the light by the window turned on. I honestly thought one of my friends had gotten up to turn it on to look for something, but everyone else flipped out and started screaming. That's when I realized that it was the light that no one could get to work all day. We assumed the bulb had burnt out. So because we had messed with it for an hour or so when we first got there, I can't say for certain that it was paranormal, but it was hysterical to me that it turned on by itself right in the middle of me talking about Lucifer. Here's a bonus. When theme parks were more reasonably priced, and I didn't have adult responsibilities, I used to go to Universal Orlando all the time. Fantasy Island and the Islands of Adventure was my favorite spot. They had tarot readers and henna artists, and the music is very Mediterranean sounding. So one day, I went with a friend, and it started raining pretty hard. The nearest place was the tarot readers, and there was no one else there. We decided to get a reading. This friend was one of those people who nickeled and dimed the hell out of anything she did. So when my reading was done, and she was still asking her reader 15 questions, my reader said she was practicing palmistry and offered a free reading. It was still raining anyway, so I accepted. I was actually very shocked. She told me I had the longest lifeline she had ever seen, but also, she saw towards the beginning that there were 2 breaks in it. Somehow, this complete stranger was able to accurately tell that I had flatlined twice as a toddler. Even after that, I was a little skeptical, so I decided to test her. For some 13 years, I lived with the ghost of a tall, lanky man in Victorian clothing. I have so many stories to tell about him. At the time, I had forbidden him from coming into my room. So when she asked if I had any more questions, I said, "There's a ghost in my house." She looked at me for a few seconds and said, "His name is Oscar. He's your grandfather. He paces in the hall because he's worried about you. His mother is with him, and he was buried in the backyard." Inwardly, I was kind of laughing. I didn't know anyone named Oscar. My grandfather certainly was not an Oscar, and all I could think of was the Muppet, the cat, or the hot dog brand. So I was laughing about it when I got home. It turns out that my great-grandfather was named Oscar. And while I can't verify that he was buried in the backyard, he died in 1944, and I discovered that we had his grafting kit. He was in his early 20s in the 1890s, and I would later find out why he was so worried about me." End quote. Our last story comes from a Red Treehouse listener who prefers to remain anonymous. Quote, "It was Western Pennsylvania, early to mid-1980s. I was around 10 years old when this happened. My BFF lived up the street from me. Let's just call her Kelly for convenience. And ours was a fairly unremarkable upbringing in a fairly unremarkable middle-class neighborhood. The neighborhood was built in the late 30s, early 40s. In a sea of traditional brick houses, Kelly's house was an imposing stone, and it was one of the biggest homes in the neighborhood. There were large, mature trees surrounding the house, and it was always kinda dark inside. Our families were friends. We went to the same church, but Kelly's family was more religious than my family. Not in any evangelical, creepy kind of way. Our church was pretty much about the golden rule: kindness, giving, acceptance. And it's hard to go overboard on trying to be a good person. But her family was just more religious. Kelly's parents hosted Bible studies in the house. Her parents made sure to sit with the kids each night to hear their bedtime prayers. Heavier religion than in my house, but nothing crazy. Kelly had extreme nightmares. We all knew about her nightmares, because it was impossible to spend the night in their house and not experience Kelly having a nightmare. And all the kids were big fans of sleepovers. It was scary, but she was my best friend. And if it meant a sleepover, I could handle her having another nightmare. She'd run through the house screaming and crying about nothing specific. But she was always trying to get away from something. Her parents had to block the front door at night because she always ran immediately to the front door to try and get out. Her parents tried to explain it as essentially night terrors, but nighttime wasn't the only time she saw things and people in her house. Kelly would hear doors open and close when she was home alone. The neighbor across the street was a retired police officer, so he would rush over when she was certain someone was in the house with her and check the entire house from top to bottom. There was never anyone there. One afternoon, a year earlier, Kelly and I had been watching TV on a Saturday afternoon when she got up to go to the bathroom. I heard her talking to someone before she came back into the family room. She said she stopped to talk to her dad briefly, since he was in the living room reading. Yeah, her dad was outside the entire time I was at their house. I could see him through the window. She was certain he'd been in the living room and talked to him while he sat quietly and stared at her. I won't rule out night terrors for the girl, but her days weren't untouched. It was summer. Kelly and I were having a sleepover at her house. It was a Friday night. Dinner, Barbies, board games. Kelly shared a huge bedroom with her older sister, but her older sister was at a sleepover at someone else's house, so her bed was for me that night. Kelly's bed was close to the front of the house, right by the front windows, and my bed was closer to the back of the house. The bedroom was on the second floor. We talked and giggled for a little bit. Her mom came in to listen to her prayers. And then we fell asleep. I hoped she wouldn't have a nightmare, but was realistic enough to know it would probably happen. She did. But this time, it was a little different. First came the screaming, which obviously instantly woke me up. Her family were used to it. They'd learned to sleep through it. She was sitting in her bed, eyes open, having a half begging, half crying conversation at nothing. She went back and forth between talking and screaming and crying, and her eyes never moved from one spot in the room. She jumped up, ripped the bed apart, and threw everything on it at nothing. Then she ran out of her room. I was pretty much paralyzed in fear in the other bed this whole time. She made it to the front door and managed to circumvent a couple of the security measures her parents had in place. And that's when her parents woke up and went running to get her. She said it was in the house and she wasn't safe. She said it was very angry that night and it wanted to keep her. Her dad kind of bear hugged her with her arms to the sides because she was swinging and throwing punches. He scooped her up and took her back to her bedroom. He sat with her for a couple minutes trying to calm her down. She kept staring at the front windows, crying and hyperventilating, saying it was real this time, asking how he couldn't see it. Eventually, she calmed down and laid back down and her dad left the room. She fell back to sleep. There was absolutely no way in hell I was falling back to sleep after that. I was wide awake and damn near ready to cry because I was so scared. And that's when I heard it. This is the part where I know I sound insane. And I know people could give a million explanations with well actually and discredit scientifically everything that happened in the next 30 seconds. But I know what I heard. It was growling. It was outside the front windows, down on the first floor, in a heavily wooded area of the landscaping. It was growling, and it was scraping. My only thought was that it was a hoof on a rock, like when goats scramble up rocks at the zoo. Scraping. And then I heard a laugh. But a very deep, dark laugh. Years later, when I saw the movie Legend, and Tim Curry as Darkness walked on screen, and did that deep, delicious, maniacal darkness laugh, I had some kind of PTSD flashback, because it took me straight back to that night. That movie still scares the shit out of me because of that laugh. It is exactly what I heard below Kelly's window that night. It was terrifying. I never spent the night at Kelly's house again. I never went into Kelly's house again. We'd stayed friends through high school, and I always found a way to never go into her house. I didn't even like to drive past her house. She never asked. I never told. To this day, I don't like driving past her house. It was 20 years before I told anyone what I experienced that night. I've researched the house. I've researched every previous owner I could find. There's nothing. No history. No deaths. It's just a house in the suburbs. For what it's worth, Kelly seems fine these days. She has a family of her own, and they all look happy and normal. Granted, everyone looks happy and normal on Facebook, because that's what people curate. But no creature ever got her, as far as I can tell. For me, though, there's no completion. There's no proof. There's no anything, really. I made it through the rest of that night by putting pillows around my head, burying myself in every blanket available, and trying to be very, very small and still. It was a long night. I'm in my 40s now, and I still remember that night like it just happened. And my final ridiculous thought that's the cherry on top of my crazy Sunday. I heard that thing, and I know it knows that. It feels, and has always felt to me, like it let me go once, with an unspoken understanding of don't try it again. I still wouldn't go back into that house, even if someone paid me. End quote. I'll admit, these stories have been among my favorites to read and tell. Each of them has a certain creep factor that makes my hair stand on end. Deep dark laughter, Ouija boards, Victorian ghosts, and spirits speaking in real time. Like I've said before, you just never know who or what you're going to encounter. It's almost impossible to explain it rationally, and you never know how long it will impact your life. Another thank you to each listener for submitting these stories. Be sure to follow them on social media and buy their books. If you have a scary story or experience you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. As we close this episode of The Red Treehouse, we're left with these lingering questions. What scary experiences have you had? What has given you the creepy feeling that you're not alone? And is it possible that there was more than the rational mind can explain away? I've shared the stories. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.